What's going on, everyone? Welcome back to another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. We have an absolutely fantastic episode for you today. I'm very fortunate to be joined by Kasim Hansen from N1. Kasim, how you doing today, my man?
I am good. It's a beautiful day here in Colorado, and this is going to be a good conversation.
It absolutely is. We have a lot of super interesting topics. Per the ethos of your brand that is N1, when it comes to individualizing a training program for muscle hypertrophy. I truly feel like what you're doing is just in a whole nother echelon. I think you guys are the top tier when it comes to this in regards to not only program variables like, you know, effort, intensity, volume, but when it comes to exercise selection and really fitting exercises to the individual, I think you guys are doing some absolutely fantastic stuff. With that being said, we're going to be diving into all of these nuances of individualizing the training program today. So, to set kind of a general background for our discussion, as the exercise science literature has continued to grow and develop, we're starting to get some really good studies about just how individual this response is. We're starting to see that some people just respond better to higher volumes, some lower. Some people respond better training closer to failure. There are others who respond to a better frequency. And while I think most people would say that you're not a special snowflake. You're probably going to fall somewhere around the mean or the average. And let's not get too carried away with how much we individualize this. I want to hear your thoughts and what you're seeing in your practice in regards to these variables. So, what are some of the main variables where you see the largest differences between individuals?
Well, aside from, individual structure, we're all shaped differently. So, in terms of what exercises may be beneficial for us, in terms of the programming, I think, and I will say that time is a thing that I will factor in there. That we obviously have trouble with the research, meaning that okay, we can test people across different volumes, frequencies, and whatnot, and we see all this variance. And what I would say is, what we also see is that that also changes per individual over the course of time, meaning that somebody's tolerance to volume, frequency, or different types of programming, whether it be more metabolic or more neurologically heavy based work, all of that stuff seems to fluctuate. And so our approach is kind of looking at a person and figuring out what is probably the things that they can recover from, and what is the bottleneck. So we will see some people come in and they just don't have very good neurological efficiency, meaning that per the amount of muscle they have, they just aren't quote unquote that strong. So putting them on really low reps may be a low ROI in terms of how much actual volume of mechanical tension they're getting out of that, right? And then we'll get other guys that, if you put them over a certain rep range, like they're getting into junk volume because they just don't have the capacity for that, right? And a lot of times you'll see some of your more, we'll say like naturally gifted athletes in terms of hypertrophy, they actually tend to be some of the ones that you don't need to push as hard with what the industry determines as like these crazy difficult programs. They're kind of the ones where it's like their skill is recovery, not performance. So actually, what we want to do is get them just to that threshold and let the fact that they just like over recover so well be the main driver. And so there's a lot of different variations in terms of the approach that we take. We see people have different tolerances across the board, and the thing is that it's kind of it's not like a systematized thing where it's like, okay, here's the volume checkbox and then here's the frequency checkbox. It might be like, well, you could tolerate this much volume and you could tolerate this frequency when we were training this way. But as soon as we shifted things, or as soon as we shifted from a surplus to a calories, the degree of change in all of those variables is also individual dependent from what we're seeing, right? And to get to the point of where do most people lie, I think if we're going to say what does it take to get a result, there's a big window for, we'll say, the majority of people to get a result. But in terms of optimal, that's where things really start to deviate. But I think the thing that people get confused at is that they think that optimal is somehow going to be 10 times better than what the baseline is. I wish that was the case, because that's like my business model is based off of, going towards optimal. But in reality, we're making percentage points improvements by enhancing all these things in most individuals. For some people, it's a night and day difference. But for your average person, it may be like, okay, if I optimize these things a little bit, one thing will compound another, but each individual variable, like getting that isolated, doesn't, give you double the gains. But what we have seen is that you get 4 or 5 things slightly optimized, and then it is a significant improvement. And both not only the results, but also just the experience of getting those results, like the degree of like pleasure to pain ratio that you get in this pursuit. I think optimal has a lot to do with that and the sustainability of the pursuit of hypertrophy or any physique goal.
Fantastic. And there's definitely some specifics I want to dive into there when it comes to this individual response and the different ways we can program training. But to kind of get into this background a little bit more, when it comes to assessing these differences, is there anything pertinent in regards to physiological mechanisms that you think are playing a large role when it comes to most differences? So you mentioned neuromuscular efficiency there and how some people are more neuromuscular efficient than others, and perhaps you could expand on that a little bit more. But other things that tend to come to mind, which people might place a large emphasis on when it comes to programming exercise, are things like fiber type distribution, and some people are just more fast twitch than others, and that's going to affect perhaps whether they should be using high reps or low reps, their frequency, because if you have large fast twitch fibers predominantly, then you're going to be able to lift heavier loads, and it's going to take you longer to recover. In regards to these factors and perhaps other things that come to mind, what do you think is going on there, mostly from a physiological perspective?
So this is where we can really get in the weeds, because there's a gazillion mechanisms at play, and the thing is that I don't think that there's like one outlier or 2 outliers or like these are the main drivers, because they all kind of compound on each other, right? Meaning that if you're more neurologically efficient, meaning that you have the ability to simultaneously contract more muscle fibers, at any given moment in time, but you are also poor at delivering oxygen, or you don't like you're genetically just poor at like your energy systems just aren't as peak. That's going to be a more drastic shift to how fast you drop off in a set versus somebody that's neurologically efficient but also has a great cardiovascular system, either from genetics or from prior training or whatever it may be. It's like all of these things play off of each other. So if we look at the very basis of, hypertrophy, we need to get a training stimulus and then we need to recover from that. And so we're going to have different facets that are going to affect our ability to stimulate versus our ability to recover. And then how those two play with each other, right? And that's kind of, we have this concept, it's called, we refer to it as trainability, which is basically the relationship of those. It's like, what does it take me to get to a stimulus, compared to what my ability is to recover from that? Because one of the things we notice is that regardless of what you happen to be, good in right now, is the longer you do that, the harder it becomes to achieve that stimulus, and therefore the more stress you have to put on your body. So basically the window between what your ability to recover is and the stress that it takes to get that stimulus starts to close, so that it becomes less of a trainable program, right? You're going to get less out of it. So when we look at mechanisms that are going to be in play in there, one of the things that I think most people don't take into account for is how much or how important their metabolic health is to the recovery from hypertrophy training. We tend to look at hypertrophy training, we look at the mechanical tension, we look at the resistance training, and this has been the theme for years. We've always focused on like the stimulus, like poking the button, pushing the button, and not really focusing on the mechanisms that come after the fact. But the reality is like, well, all of that, signaling, all of that protein synthesis, all of that stuff, it requires energy. And how efficient you are at both coming back to homeostasis in terms of ATP levels, in terms of glucose and glycogen levels, like those are all going to be the main limiting factors before we can even talk about building hypertrophy. So one of the things that we have really highlighted is how important it is to make sure that you aren't bottlenecking your recovery by just simply being like too deconditioned. So your ribosomes, those are little things that like take and build the proteins. They don't work for free, right? Like none of this stuff in the cell works for free. So that basically the better you are at making energy, and the better you can do that at a lower stress threshold, the better your recovery from hypertrophy training will be, because the limiting factor will not be energy production. Now it's like, well, did I get enough stimulus, and then do I have enough of just the building blocks to actually do that? But what you'll see is a lot of people, because they train what we would typically call hypertrophy workouts over and over and over again, they're trying to push stimulus and adaptation. So maybe they've accumulated some myonuclei, maybe they've upregulated the amount of ribosomes, so their protein factory essentially is bigger, but the ability to pay the workers of that factory is poor because they have not done any metabolic work. They haven't trained those energy systems. And so when we look at these mechanisms, it's not so much about driving one mechanism and making it the king of all mechanisms. It's not like there's a hypertrophy button or a protein synthesis button that we can just push and push and push and push. What it is it's about keeping those mechanisms in somewhat of a balance, those adaptations in somewhat of a balance, that we're always trying to remove whatever's the weakest link in the chain. So if it's energy, that's one thing. If it's a new person that starts training, like they've just started training, they're not going to have a lot of machinery to deal with muscle damage, and they're not going to have a lot of the actual machinery within their cells to do protein synthesis, which means the magnitude and the rate at which they can do it is just less. So when we start creating some of these mechanical traumas, those are some of the things that start getting upregulated, right? But if all we do is just continually try and like do mechanical damage type work to those muscle tissues, that's no longer going to be the limitation in 3, 6, 9 weeks or whatever down the road. It's going to be something else that is actually the limiting factor. So it's everything from, how well you can produce energy systemically, to how well you can produce energy locally, to how well we can deliver fuel from a performance perspective, to how well we can recruit the tissue, and then how much actual machinery do we have to then repair that tissue after the fact. Because if you look at anybody that's done different hypertrophy protocols and stuff, and they've done it over the course of years, they'll notice that their tolerance to certain types of things changes. Like everybody, the simplest thing is to go back to the exercise. When everybody starts a new exercise, they're always sore in that exercise, regardless. You may have been training quads for like 6 years, and then all of a sudden somebody shows you this new quad exercise, and it's like, why are you sore? You have all of the machinery in those quads to repair. You have all of the mechanisms to deliver fuel to the quads. Why all of a sudden, just because you did a slightly different activity, is that sore? And that's where the nervous system component comes in, is like when you're doing that exercise, you're just less coordinated. So per effort and tension that you're putting in that, because the contraction's a little less coordinated, you cause a little bit more trauma to the tissue than you otherwise would. And then what happens after 2 weeks, all of a sudden, now that exercise doesn't make you any more sore than, another equivalent exercise that you maybe had been more versed in, right? But you could argue like, well, okay, when you start that new exercise, there's a novel stimulus because we're getting that extra tension. But in 2 weeks, that will no longer be the factor, right? And so that's just kind of microcosm of the macrocosm of all of these mechanisms. So the thing I would like to just recap with that is that I don't think that we focus on one. I think it's about always looking for what pathway or what mechanisms or what perceivable performance recovery metric could we plausibly see as the weakest link of the chain or the bottleneck. And that's kind of how we periodize, is we're always looking at, okay, once we do something, as soon as something else starts becoming the limiting factor, we're going to go and address that in some way, shape, or form. So like, for instance, when we do, a macrocycle block, our mesocycles are probably shorter if you look at them as their individual units, meaning that we may say, okay, we're going to focus on what would be traditionally called like hypertrophy work for maybe say 3-4 weeks. And then we would maybe jump out and do 1 or 2 weeks of more what we would call like metabolic or conditioning work. It's higher reps or lower rest or some various techniques that are challenging either the local or systemic energy systems. And then we'll jump back in. But because it's only like you step out for like a week or two, it's really like a longer mesocycle that had a pit stop in the middle to do some maintenance on those other mechanisms to make sure they didn't become the limiting factor. So I might still have somebody run a 12, 16 week hypertrophy block, but they're going to have little pit stops in there. We're going to change the tires and stuff throughout that so that that doesn't become the limiting factor. Because the last thing that you want to do is get to a point where all of a sudden now you're recovering poor because it's like, all right, I got so good at this task that I completely outran my recovery. And now I'm essentially either just stalling myself, working backwards. Now I maybe have to take a longer deload, or do drastic shifts to my calories and stuff like that to try and compensate for that. That isn't going to suit me from either an efficiency standpoint or from like my actual end destination. Maybe now I'm going to have to reach that point with more body fat or in a greater state of, metabolic fatigue and stuff like that.
Fascinating. I definitely have a lot of thoughts going through my head here. Many questions, but I think your points do lead into our next topic quite nicely. But before we get there, real quick, if we took an individual who perhaps you've been working with for a while, you basically assessed their baseline weaknesses and you constructed a program to address those, and you've gotten them to a point where overall they're pretty solid. They're not too weak in any specific area. For that individual, and considering this kind of periodized approach you mentioned, would a traditional hypertrophy block for you just be something in terms of, and let's not get too stuck on the numbers, we'll say 12 weeks, but over that 12 weeks, we are going to be running through three different sorts of phases within there just to keep a maintenance on all of those things that do matter for hypertrophy. Um, yeah, is that kind of what you're getting at there for someone who has no glaring weaknesses? That might be a good approach to kind of cycle through these different processes, which might play an important role, just to make sure that nothing deteriorates more so than the others.
Yeah. So basically, the two things that we're looking at maintaining as we're doing hypertrophy work. Obviously, if you're doing hypertrophy work, the thing that you really don't have to focus on maintaining is all of the things that are like responsible for upregulating protein synthesis and whatnot, because that's going to be done the bulk of your training. So it's the local energy systems of the muscles themselves, and then your systemic energy production, which is going to be correlated to like resting heart rate and HRV and the amount of cortisol and stuff that you make throughout the day. So what we'll tend to see is that when people are starting to lose their local conditioning, what will happen is they won't partition nutrients as well, and their performance, like their tolerance to volume within a session, starts to go down. Right. So basically it's like, well, if you're not replenishing glycogen levels, you're not really good at synthesizing ATP and mobilizing stuff within a workout. What happens is you reach a plateau, or your performance starts to drop off within a session faster. That's the most tangible metric for us to look at, but it's harder to measure the actual recovery, of how much that's diminished, other than we went back in, maybe we didn't get performance because there's a lot more factors. So if there was an anecdotal tangible thing that you could look at, it'd be like, okay, if my tolerance to volume seems to be dropping off, meaning that I'm starting the workout actually, and maybe I have improved performance, maybe my strength has gone up, or I'm able to hit a few more reps on the early sets, but for some reason it starts crashing, it may be actually that like my local energy systems are now the lagging piece to this puzzle, and would focus on them. When it comes to the systemic, that's where we tend to see people have intolerance to frequency, and just like kind of overall gross fatigue, because that's like, okay, that's their energy systems throughout their whole body, right? So if it takes more stress hormones to mobilize nutrients, right, that's not a good thing if we're focusing on hypertrophy, because we're going to be running at just a slightly higher cortisol level all day long, right? And in a day, that's not much of an issue. But over 16 weeks, you can imagine that, like, okay, that's me slightly trying to fight to get harder to get into an anabolic state, right? And it's going to affect my HRV. It's going to affect my insulin sensitivity. And a lot of these things that, like, on an individual level, may seem insignificant, but you start stacking up all of those things over time, and then, okay, now we can see a significant difference over that course time in terms of how much muscle could I have put on. So when people are losing that, what you'll see is sometimes they just have a harder time actually recovering between sets, like from a cardiovascular standpoint. They're breathing hard, their heart rate doesn't come down. That's an easy one. They tend not to tolerate the frequency as well, right? And so it's like, okay, if you were to give them an extra day rest, all of a sudden their performance would go back up. So it's like, okay, if they're having issues with just the frequency, but they can perform within the workout, and this is typical. You see this is the bro thing of like, well, okay, if I take an extra scoop of pre-workout, all of a sudden I can tolerate that workout just fine and maintain that. That's likely a sign that if you were at a little bit better, like global systemic metabolic health, you would be recovering better between sessions, because you would just be in a better anabolic to catabolic ratio in terms of your hormones, in terms of your nutrient partitioning, et cetera. Your likely your baseline threshold for when your body goes, from parasympathetic to sympathetic gets lower as we get in better shape. So when you're not in shape, you go into stress mode very easy. When you are in shape, like getting up and walking across the room doesn't necessarily shift your body's physiology. So a lot of times you have these guys that they're so focused on hypertrophy, where they're just like gorging on food and doing this tension-based training, that they systemically get so deconditioned that it's like, okay, basically any activity that we do challenges our ability to be in anabolic state, because it throws us into a sympathetic, state, right? You live in a 2-story townhome or something like that, and it's like, man, every time you got to go to the stairs, you need a post-workout shake now to get you back into an anabolic state. Like, that's not where you want to be.
Excellent. When it comes to assessing these weaknesses and looking at the individual at baseline, how do we go about this? Things that come to mind could be that, when you get someone new, maybe there's just some sort of like baseline workout that you take them through to kind of assess their work capacity, or maybe even max reps at a certain percent to kind of assess neuromuscular efficiency. How strong are they for the amount of muscle they have? How do you guys tend to go about that? Is there some sort of baseline workout that you like to look at? Do you just take their prior training history and kind of go from there and then see how they respond?
Well, the training history is the most valuable. And because of that, I will ask you to qualify, just so that I can give you the best possible answer, is that when you say new, what do you mean by new? Because new could be somebody's first workout, or it could be somebody that's like, okay, they've been training for a while, or they did high school athletes and whatnot, and now they're just now starting a hypertrophy journey. Like, what do you mean by someone new?
I'll give the context of new for what I'm most interested in, and I think that our listeners are most interested in, because just like you, I think we like to talk about nuance on this podcast. We like to talk about like those couple of percentage points that will result in like half a millimeter on your biceps, which don't matter to most people, but we love these sorts of discussions. So I'm going to say new in the context of, you got this person, they're new to you, but they're actually probably pretty advanced and have a lot of muscle.
Mm-hmm. So that works out. I mean, that works out as to be the easiest population to assess, because they're often coming in with a decent training history. And usually the first decision that we make is, whatever you've been doing, we're not going to do that. Because chances are that's the least likely stimulus that's going to be like prime for new adaptations. And that's the reality of it. It doesn't matter if we have somebody coming in for hypertrophy or for fat loss or for power or whatever. I would say 90% of the time we put somebody on something that they would not associate with their primary goal, because that's what's been neglected. That's the bottleneck, is not in the thing that they've been doing over and over and over and over again, right? So, if you take, like, you take a baseball player, right, and all they do is hit balls, right? They're just working the batting cage all day. They've been doing that for 5 years. Guess what skill set they probably don't need to work on, right? Who knows? Maybe they can't throw to save their life, right? They can hit a home run every time, but they can't throw to save their life. So it's like, okay, can't put this guy on the field. He's going to be a pitch hitter at best. So that's essentially what we get, is we get people that are very one-dimensional, because they tend to have focused on that one thing, right? And in the pursuit of that, have managed to somehow not achieve that because of that one-dimensional format. So training history is usually the first thing, and a lot of our with that population, we can get a lot of information by just kind of asking about how they've been responding to their current training, right? Like, okay, like, you know, how sore do they get? Do they get a pump? Do they keep the pump throughout their whole workout, or does it go away? Usually in this population, they're also managing their diet well or whatever, so we can ask them, you know, how much does their performance change when they add carbohydrates or have a refeed, or you know, any of these things that even if we look at some of the literature and that says like, hey, doing refeeds is not necessarily that big of a deal if we standardize for calorie intake and macros across a week or whatever. And it's like, okay, but I can take and look at how somebody responds to a refeed and get an idea of how they are able to deal with that acute influx of carbohydrates. Like, it's like, okay, if you have a 600 gram of carb day, your normal is 200, whatever. Does your body soak that up like a sponge? Do you become a water buffalo? Does your energy go up? Do you go into a coma? Like, these are all like, this is all valuable data. Can say like, okay, how is your body dealing with these physiological challenges? And that can give me an idea of like, okay, what of these mechanisms are working well and which ones probably are the bottleneck, right? So it's, you know, it can ask like, okay, what would happen if you superset an upper and a lower body exercise, right? Okay, well, I would puke on the floor. Okay, systemically, we're probably not that conditioned right now. Okay, you know, so we'll look and see like what type of training they've been doing. Have they been doing straight sets? Have they been doing supersets? Have they been doing supersets for different body parts but not the same body parts? Are they incorporating any conditioning work? Is it high intensity? Is it low intensity? You know, and of course, like what type of progress are they making within that? Do they have a history of like, well, when I train like this, I get really sore, or when I train like this, I get really strong? You know, or if I train like this, my sleep goes to crap. Like those are all things that we could kind of look at. And the one thing that seems to be consistent with that group is they at least are tracking their training usually in some way, shape, or form, right? By the time they write the check to an N1 coach, they usually have done that. They've checked the boxes of like the bare minimums of like they've worked with the spreadsheet before, and they've tracked things and getting an idea of how somebody's performing and how those performance variables relate to some of these other biometrics can give us an idea of where they need to push. So without trying to dig deeper and deeper into the nuances, because we just won't get there in an hour, if I give some very practical examples, a lot of times when we have people come in, if they've been doing a lot of low rep, long rest period training, okay, they're likely systemically deconditioned unless they've been doing something to maintain that. And so that's going to be the biggest thing. And so our approach generally is find the weak link in recovery, get rid of that right at the front of the program. Because if I can bring up your recovery early, I can use that improved recovery for all of the subsequent weeks, right? But if we start out and we get like 4 or 6 weeks where your recovery really wasn't that great, that's 4 or 6 weeks that I maybe have been able to have gotten better results. I've maybe been able to squeak out a little bit more performance or a little bit more adaptation had we led with that. So if I look at that, I'm like, okay, the weak link in this person probably from recovery and a performance perspective is that they're not systemically conditioned enough to be able to tolerate more volume or more intensity than what they're doing now. If I have somebody where it's like, okay, they get sore really easy, they have very poor tolerance to volume, you might be like, okay, they might locally be conditioned, meaning that volume becomes a local metabolic stress to them, right? And so we need to essentially for them do something where we're focusing on, improving nutrient partitioning and really focusing on those energy systems. So that's where we will use something like an incomplete rest method is one of the ones that we go, whereas it's like you're using sub-maximal weights, but you're using short rest periods. So you're not hitting a high RPE or RIR on every set, but what you're doing with that short rest period is you're working up to a higher RPE, lower RIR by the time you get. So like the one I always quote is the famous Vince Gironda, 8x8 with 30 seconds. That is by no means the only way to do that. You can do it with lower reps, higher reps, less sets, whatever. But it's simply working at an incomplete rest ratio so that you're building up fatigue over time. And by doing that, I kind of look at it as like revving an engine. rather than holding it at red line. And for those people, that's what they need, is they need that engine to be revved to kind of warm up and build up some of those metabolic adaptations. And so we use that a lot too. And what we tend to see is that people tend to pull more intramuscular water, and we tend to see like that they just start holding more glucose and glycogen. Like, so that's one of those ones where it's like, okay, if we put somebody in a systemic phase, we're looking at, okay, does resting heart rate go down? Does their HRV improve? Does their recovery between sets improve? Like, those are our metrics. For an IRM, we actually have a visual marker. It's like, okay, if we put you on this, does it actually look like you volumize your lean tissue? Which is, you need somebody to be a certain body fat percentage to see that, right? Obviously, if you come in at 40% body fat, not going to be able to tell that, you're holding an extra 25 grams of glycogen in your biceps or whatever it may be. But in a fairly lean population, right? Which I guess if you're focusing on hypertrophy, hopefully we can see your muscles. If not, we maybe need to switch goals. Is that you should be able to like see a visual difference if some of these things are working, going from a more kind of like traditional like tension based protocol to this, is we should see a volumization of those tissues, right? And then when we don't see that, if we see somebody go into that and all of a sudden they actually like have a very like almost like an inflammatory response where it seems like they don't pull fluid into the muscle, they actually hold more subcutaneous water, and their performance goes down instead of up, when their sleep starts to get crappy, that can tell us that that person also probably was poorly conditioned. So they actually need to get the systemic condition done, then the local condition, then we can go back to hypertrophy. It's like, okay, you're missing like all of the recovery mechanisms in terms of how optimal those are. Hopefully that gives a little bit of context, but 9 times out of 10, we are starting with either a systemically challenging thing, which a good example of that is like, where we're supersetting upper, lower body, or at the very least agonist, antagonist body part. It's a fast pace, type of thing where we're keeping the heart rate high, or we're focusing on locally challenging those metabolic systems, either with longer sets, and I tend to use supersets over like high reps, just because I think it's a lot more bang for your buck. Because I think like if we do a set of 20, those first 10 reps are kind of a waste. I would rather have you do like an 8 and an 8 and get something more productive out of it. So it's either that long sets or very short rests, something that challenges that local energy system of the muscle tissue, right? And need to check both of those off, and then we essentially have a license to go for that mechanical tension stimulus, and knowing that it will be the limiting factor, right? So it's like, okay, that's now going to be the limiting factors. It's like, how much stimulus can I get in this, and how much recovery can I have from that stress? That's going to be the limiting factor. It's not going to be like, well, I just didn't have that many hours in the day that I was really in a good recovery mode because I was too poor conditioned, right? Or I just can't get that adequate of a stimulus or recovery because I'm not that good at making the energy during the workout, and I'm not that good at replenishing the energy outside of the workout.
Excellent. So many useful points to consider there. What's coming to my mind is that I think we all can agree that the majority of training should be based around, this principle of mechanical tension, right? And we've discussed in the podcast a couple of times, this concept of metabolic stress, and is it a unique mechanism for muscle hypertrophy, or is it really just like a backdoor to mechanical tension? And based on what you're saying, I think perhaps a reasonable conclusion is, well, who cares? We know it's basically equally effective as these traditional mechanical tension techniques, and you're probably really bad at it. So if we know it's going to generate similar hypertrophy, and just as an organism, it's going to improve you, it's probably a good idea to spend some time doing this training.
Mm-hmm. Now, one note I'll make, and I think this is a challenge with the research, is a lot of the times that when they're comparing, say, like a more metabolically based protocol to a more like high tension based protocol, is they're doing them, exclusively and for the same amount of time. And I think both of those is like, okay, it's almost like we're comparing which one of these is worse rather than which one of these would be awesome, because the metabolic adaptations that we get they come really fast. Like we adapt metabolically very fast. We adapt from a hypertrophy perspective in terms of those mechanisms much slower, which is why we don't just start training and we just turn into like the Incredible Hulk. But we go from like, wheezing and laying on the floor to actually looking like we're not dying in the gym relatively fast. And that's important. Like if we look at evolution, it's pretty important that we are able to make very rapid changes physiologically in terms of how we deal with metabolic functions. Like we can become fat adapted fairly fast. We can, adapt to taking in more carbohydrates relatively fast. We can switch the fuel sources that we're using very fast, right? Like it takes a lot less time to change our mitochondrial count than it is then we can upgrade our percentage of mitochondria mass a lot faster than we can upregulate myonuclei in the muscle tissue, right? And a lot of that makes sense from an evolutionary perspective. So when you look at the comparisons of these things, I think it's also important to understand that it's not that like, well, this is just as good as that. The likely it's the best one for you is going to be the one that you're going to be able to show the most improvement in. And don't stay there longer than you need to show those improvements, because I think when you run these studies for long periods of times, or at least in the way that we have to fit the controls of research, by nature we're not able to do quote unquote what would be optimal, which like our approach. Luckily, we have a gazillion N of 1 studies instead of like a big population study where it's like, okay, when this person starts running into this wall and we shift them over to this, they start seeing better results, right? And then when they go back to that, now they're improving better than they were when they finished the last mesocycle of that similar training. So that's the cool thing that I'm looking forward to, is once we get to a point where we can almost like test auto-regulated principles over time, instead of just like, okay, we're just going to do, this group's going to do sets of 20, this group's going to do sets of whatever. Because in all of those groups, what you will see is that a certain percentage will do really well, some average, and some not. And it's almost the same regardless of what parameters. When you throw it in for a bunch of time, it always just seems like, okay, it seems very similar. But in reality, when I look at that and I'm like, okay, so what you're telling me is that if we take a population of people, random people, and we throw them in a study, at any given point in time, some of them would have been better off training like more high tension. Some of them would have been training off more metabolic. Some of them would have maybe more training something in between or whatever. It's like, okay, so in reality, what we really would have been better off of is matching the person to what they needed on intake. And that's what I would love to see is like, okay, wait, if we did a study and we looked at the people that responded well and there were people that didn't, and then we actually flipped them into the opposing thing, but all of a sudden we see an inverse relationship of like, okay, the people that weren't doing well with, high tension, high volume of sets, all of a sudden did well with like longer sets, more longer, fewer sets. Like that approach was the thing that they happened to need at that point in time. And that's where I kind of separate with the usefulness of what we see in some of the research data versus what I see in the field, because I'm never going to have somebody do a metabolic program for 12 weeks. It's just like, it's going to stop being effective at, between 2 and 4 weeks. It's the diminishing returns are going to start stacking up. And I know that if I keep doing that, like I'm just going to just smash them into the ground. Right now with hypertrophy training, the performance in that training tends to essentially auto-regulate you a little bit, meaning that you just stop being able to do as much. And so like people kind of peter through, and what they'll have is they'll show like a period of weeks where they didn't get quite as good a result. And then all of a sudden their body will have like, it almost like it deloads for you by just, hampering your performance. Right. And I would rather be piloting that myself than my body being like, yeah, no, you keep going to the gym, you keep doing your thing, you keep double scooping it, but nothing's happening for the next couple of weeks. You're like no results for 2 weeks. We're focusing on other things. I would rather be in control of that and saying like, okay, if this is run out, is there something else that I can use to potentiate further results to improve my recovery, et cetera? And I always try and get a week ahead of that. Sorry, rambling now. But I think it's important that when we look at the way things are being compared, is understanding that the context that they are being compared may or may not actually be applicable to how we would use these things in the gym. And that's one of the biggest, I would say, debate points I have with some people that are very ingrained in the research is I'm like, look, what the research is showing is valid, but also ask yourself, are we ever going to train a person like that isn't confined to a research study like that, right? Would that be the optimal way to do it? Or is that just the way that we had to do to investigate this thing? Because we have to restrict a lot of things when we're trying to, focus in on this one little thing that we wouldn't necessarily do, in the gym.
Yeah, and that's ultimately evidence-based practice, right? We have to understand the limitations of the research and what it can show us, and then there is definitely value in practical experience. Hopefully, one day we can get to a point with these studies where potentially we utilize some sort of auto-regulated approach like you described. But I think we're a few decades from there, considering we just started getting training studies that actually considered the baseline training volume of the participants.
Mm-hmm.
So we're taking steps in the right direction, but we'll see how things continue to develop. If we take this individual, we assess their needs, we got them on this baseline program to kind of resolve these glaring inefficiencies within them, and we now have them in a really good spot. How do we assess the results they are obtaining from their program? For this question and the answer you provide, I think we can kind of gloss over body composition assessments because like there is a large variance between devices and the most precise ones not being widely available. And if we consider more practical ways of kind of measuring how a person is responding, we can look at their training performance. So I guess there touch on if there's anything else practical we can look at besides training performance. And then if we are looking at training performance, what is a sufficient indicator that you're getting better? Can we look at performance on one set of a multi-joint exercise? Should we look at performance over multiple sets? Should we be assessing performance strictly on single joint isolation movements when it comes to assessing potential changes in muscle size? What are your thoughts there?
So when I'm assessing progress, I assess whatever biometrics I have of recovery and then performance. Because what I'm trying to do is I'm trying to predict where that wall is before we run into it. So in terms of my negative feedback assessment would be looking at the recovery markers and saying like, okay, what's going on? Is sleep quality going down? Is there all of a sudden a change in mood and appetite, morning heart rate, things like that? Whatever, like if you're using an R ring, HRV, whatever, like all of that stuff can be useful data, but it's like, okay, if I see a negative trend in recovery, that's my sign from a negative feedback perspective that we are probably approaching the point where we're going to get diminishing returns. And that's usually where I want to make the shift rather than just like, hey, let's do the week of no results. Like, why don't we actually stop the week before that and actually like almost, do the maintenance that we needed to do, come back and just like remove those inefficient weeks. Now, from a positive feedback, that's where the gym performance stuff really comes in, right? So that's a sign that things are moving forward. Now, we program, we'll say, more strict in terms of the type of stimulus that we go for. So it tends to be like some people, you'll see that like, okay, they do some heavy work and then they do some light work, and there's just a cluster of different types of things that they're doing. We tend to be a little bit more stringent. One of my rationales for that is that we are being more specific in the mechanisms that we're challenging. And so that gives me a better ability to periodize. The other is it also gives me a better ability to assess, because whatever type of stimulus I'm driving, I can be more predictive to the performance I would expect to achieve if my program is kind of more honed in on that. So if I'm doing a mix of heavy and light stuff in the same program, it's hard for me to know like, well, okay, are we getting stronger on this, and are we getting more capacity on this other thing? Or like, I'm expecting all these things to happen at once. How do I know the ratio that they should be going on, or whatever? So we tend to be focusing on certain things. So if a program will say the needle is shifted closer towards, it's more of a functional hypertrophy or like power building or whatever nomenclature you want to use. It's lower rep, higher load, higher intensity type work. I'm going to expect the performance metric to be in line with that, right? Meaning that if the main driver that we're trying to do is this intensity-based work, which is, pounds on the bar or whatever, I'm going to expect the majority of my progressions to be in that. If it's on more of the capacity range, I'm going to expect to see improvements in capacity, right? And so that's where we could start looking at some of these, like, okay, that's where, maybe looking at total work volume, like volume load and stuff like that could, be a little bit more valuable. And then if it's in the middle, it's, which is where most hypertrophy stuff is going to be, it's going to kind of be that tolerance to both of those things, like almost like a staggered approach of like, okay, sometimes I can go up in reps, sometimes I can go up in weight. And what I'm looking for is the ability to maintain tolerance or improve the amount of, we'll say, effective reps that I can accomplish. Which, if you want to be anal about it, you can estimate it, but it requires quite a bit of math, or at least a very well done spreadsheet at this point in time. But if you're looking at, okay, how many sets am I doing and what's that average RPE or average RIR across those, right? It's like looking at is like, okay, am I able to maintain the same set volume at the same relative RPE, RIR, or am I able to improve that, right? So if I'm able to do the same number of sets and slightly nudge that RPE or RIR up, and I'm still able to recover and improve, I'm looking at that as like we are tolerating a higher volume of effective reps than we were prior, and that's the direction that I want to go. And where this gets a little messy, and you see this kind of debate in the industry right now of like, well, do we add sets? Do we add, like, what do we add or whatever, which is some of the things I've been trying to address in this progressive overload course, is that sometimes in the attempt of driving the volume of effective reps up, what we have to do is, well, we add sets, but we may either stagnate or even lower the average RPE across those when we add that other set. It just depends. Like for some people, because like one approach out there right now is you start really low so that it's pretty easy to add volume and continue to progress. That's a safe way of doing progressions. But again, if we're chasing optimal, we don't want to be far away from the optimal point and just going from like, well, we're really under it and then we're trying to get over it. It's like, wouldn't it be better to be at optimal as often as possible? And that's where you have to be a little bit more fine-tuned. So I'm looking at, do I tolerate, or what is my performance? And we'll say those working sets. I want to see the volume of work and the performance specifically going up in terms of that. So because if I were to say do the same sets, the same weight as last week, and the RPE goes down, that's a sign that like, well, okay, I have progressed, but that's also a sign that, okay, I probably got less stimulus today than I did a week ago. So what my goal would be to like to keep that volume of effective reps equal, not have it become easier, if that makes sense. And if I'm able to do that, right, I can use the one metric as a sign of like, well, okay, we got a positive adaptation, but on the day I can say, all right, we're not trending towards what we need to either maintain or move that stimulus up a little bit, then I can make sure I do that. And the second that I can't do that, the second that the same amount of work becomes a higher RPE, right, or a lower RIR average across that lets me know, okay, I'm under recovered right now. Because like in the hypertrophy realm, if all of a sudden the same amount of work is harder, right, that's a sign that we're moving in the wrong direction. And usually, if we're looking at those recovery metrics before, and this is what we've compiled a ton of N-of-1 data on, is usually we can see a blip in those recovery metrics that precedes the performance metrics by a week or two, right? And so that's why I'm like, okay, watch the recovery stuff first, because I feel like I have a license to push the training a little bit more aggressively if I'm looking for that point of diminishing returns. And then I don't get greedy. I jump out, do a little bit of maintenance work on some of the other things, focus on bringing the recovery back up, and then jump back in. And then I can maintain essentially more productive, more optimal based training for more weeks of the year doing it that way than I can having the last 2 weeks of every mesocycle kind of like pushing that point of diminishing returns where we're working hard, but we're not really getting anything from it.
Very cool. Um, You mentioned there that ultimately performance should be increasing in some capacity. I've heard some individuals mention that when we're using training performance to potentially assess increases in muscle size over time, that it might not be a good idea to use multi-joint lifts due to increase in performance, potentially being mostly from neuromuscular adaptations, becoming more efficient at performing the skill of the exercise. And then more so when it comes to a single set of that performance improvements could potentially just be a product of the aforementioned reasons, plus just being a little more stimulated that day. Um, Again, so kind of clouding our judgment in regards to if we're actually getting better. Do you think those are a concern, and as such, single joint movements would be better to assess potential changes in muscle size, or do you think that over time, performance improvements are likely just beneficial and indicate something positive is going on?
So if you look at it in a micro window of just comparing this week to last week, then that creates room for a lot of these errors to kind of give us some false data. But if we look at trends over time, we tend to buffer a lot of those things out. So, for instance, we look at a compound exercise, because we can essentially, like, and say something like a squat, we can alter our technique per rep on whether or not, it's a little bit more quad, a little bit more hippie, or whatnot. I mean, that's the way our body compensates to deal with load. Is it's trying to constantly shift to whatever can work the most efficiently under those conditions, right? And fatigue and whatnot all becomes a portion of that. So there is more variability. There's a tremendous amount of variability in some of these big compound movements. So if you're just comparing like one to one, and you're making your sole decision off of that, absolutely. But now if you're looking at a trend over several weeks, now all of a sudden it's like, okay, like if I'm continuing to improve, right? Like how bad was my squat at the start? If I'm able to make 6 weeks of consistent improvement and it's only technique based and nothing else. So I don't think that you completely discount compound exercises as a marker for them. I think you can be skeptical of making decisions on that data acutely, just comparing 2 sessions to each other. But I think looking over, a period of time, that data will essentially, like, the accuracy improves over the consistency and the volume of data that we have, rather than just the individual thing. Because say we take something simple like elbow flexion. Right, elbow flexion, we're doing a preacher curl. People would say, well, that's pretty simple. Okay, pretty simple. It's a lot harder to cheat. It is, but I also can balance out like lack of bicep recovery today with a little bit more brachioradialis. So and I can tweak I could tweak my hand position just a little bit, and like, well, it's a little bit more semi-supinated than supinated today, or like, so these things are always going to be a part of that. So at the end of the day, I think, and this is the thing that we always focus on in terms of education, is we teach biomechanics first, because it's like, if we can't standardize the reps, then what are we counting, right? Like, we're counting sets, but sets of what? Well, like, I don't know, some random gobble of like somebody moving a piece of mass from point A to point B. Like, awesome. So we moved iron like 70 meters this day, and then we moved it in a different way, but still 70 meters, the same amount. Like, that's not what we're tracking. So all of this stuff is not really worth thinking about if we're not actually training with good technique. So that's just like, I look at that as the foundational thing. So if your squat's changing so much that you can't really track it, maybe you should not be so anal about like, is the squat a hypertrophy thing? Of like, actually, you know what? Who cares? You need to get better at squatting right now. That's the goal. So if your squat's going up, who cares? Because until it gets good enough that you can maintain consistency over reps and sets, it's never going to be a valid metric. Right. And that's just the reality of it. It's like, at that point of your training career, maybe you just need to have the skill of training. That's the prerequisite that you need to actually get to optimal. I mean, if you're training for a show or something like that, where you have like this sudden deadline, well, then maybe, okay, just get in the hack squat, dude. Let's eliminate the skill variable, and let's just, reduce the chances of error there. But I think you have to take all this stuff in context, and where it matters and whatnot, right? Because for a lot of people, they may have a compound lift in there. We've done this for people that it's like, I want to get big, but I also want to squat, like, or whatever. Their squat is terrible, and it's like, okay, your squat is in this program. It may not be the main hypertrophy driver. It's there for the technique. So you may not even hit like a high RPE on your squat sessions for several weeks until they reach a certain competency, and then you have permission to go to fatigue, to push load, etc. So you can have essentially like you can have like skill-based goals that are going to potentiate your ability to stimulate hypertrophy down the road, especially if you're in that context. So I think, I'm probably overcomplicating the answer. The answer is yes, those things matter, but how much do they matter really depends on the context and the window of time that you're looking for them. And reality is that if we're looking at performance as a metric, our ability to proxy that to hypertrophy is limited. So what you should be looking for is like, I have a sound reason to believe that this stimulus that I'm achieving in training is going to contribute to hypertrophy. What I need to know is that the training program itself is providing fruitful results. But acutely, week on week, the amount of hypertrophy that I'm gaining is not going to have a significant performance, quality on the majority of these things. Especially like myofibular is a great one, or myonuclear. I'm sorry. This is like, okay, if I got one more nuclei that I did last week, right? Am I going to be an animal in the gym? No, right? But if I do that for several weeks, my potential for hypertrophy goes up over time, right? But how do you measure that? Like how much bigger are my biceps if I get a few more nuclei in there, right? Like it's like, I don't think that's going to show up on the ultrasound or the tape measure or anything else. So I think it's a mistake to try and make too much of a leap in terms of what the performance metrics mean, other than, the programming I'm doing is working from week to week. Now, from start to end of that program, that's where then I evaluate how effective was that in terms of hypertrophy for me, right? Because if I do something for 6 weeks, 12 weeks, or whatever, and I look exactly the same, okay, cool. That was a good strength program for me, but it's not a good hypertrophy thing for me. Unfortunately, that takes some time to know, if you're trying to figure that out for yourself. But there may be points in your career where the limiting factor for you is like, well, in order for me to actually do better at this hypertrophy thing, I need to go back and get stronger for a few weeks. Now that thing works for you, and then you can bring that in, and it just goes back to that whole, that periodization of the mechanisms things is like, because the weakness for you could be like, well, my neurological efficiency is actually pretty poor right now. I should probably do some strength work. Same thing for conditioning work, right? You might do some very metabolic work and look like you gain no muscle mass or whatever, right? But it may be the thing that allows you to gain more muscle mass in the next meso. And so that's where the proxies of like, make sure the program that you're doing is doing whatever physiological thing that you think you can attribute to it, and that you're getting improvements in that. Because that's like, you have to almost look at programs as like skills. If this is a lift heavy program, I expect to be able to lift heavier. If this is a like push volume program, I expect to tolerate more volume. If this is a capacity program, I expect to be able to either do more or be able to, get the same capacity in less time, et cetera. Like, I expect improvements in those metrics, right? And then I use periodization as the way of like, okay, bringing all those together to make myself a more bigger human.
Awesome. Yeah, I definitely don't think you're overcomplicating things. I think your answers are perfect and they're providing the necessary context to some of these questions. I mean, when it comes to any question, no matter how simple they might appear on the surface, the right answer has a whole lot of gray that I personally feel needs to be discussed. Whether or not people want to hear all of it or anything else is another topic of discussion. If you want a simple answer, you're not actually curious in the truth or getting closer to the truth, which is an issue in and of itself. But transitioning to some more specific questions here as we wrap things up, you mentioned a couple of times these kind of brief metabolic blocks within these larger macro cycles. So if we're looking at some sort of metabolic block for 2 to 3 weeks, and you discuss some potential strategies here, which include the Garanda method or 8 sets of 8. Something similar that comes to mind is like muscle rounds from Dr. Scott Stevenson. So you have like the 6 sets of 4, but there's only one failure point on that last set. You also touched on potentially using some sort of supersets, whether that be maybe antagonist paired sets or an upper lower superset. And I think you did said that you probably prefer these strategies over using something like higher reps, which I think when most people consider metabolite techniques, they're thinking of like primarily just higher rep training with shorter rests. If you've kind of sold someone on this idea and they're thinking to themselves, I do want to incorporate these short blocks to make sure that I'm not missing out on anything, and I want to prioritize metabolic stress within these periods. Do you have anything else to add there in regards to the general structure for how they set these things up? Are the strategies that we've been talking about kind of pick and choose? What do you like best? And they're all probably pretty good. Is there anything you definitely wouldn't recommend, or perhaps some sort of transition between these strategies over the 2 weeks?
Yeah, so I mean the basic principle of what we look for metabolic is we kind of break it up into three. The systemic is like that upper lower example, and that's where basically you don't want to tax anything like you don't want to tax an individual muscle that hard. What you're looking at is working a lot of tissue over a short amount of time. And that's why you're supersetting upper lower different body groups. It's like, okay, I want to basically kind of hit, we'll say, quote unquote, the lactate threshold. Most people are familiar with that, right? Lactic threshold of that point, but not dig into that and then move to another muscle and another muscle. Because what I'm trying to do is create enough muscular stress in a diverse range of tissues that makes me have to work harder from a cardiovascular standpoint, from a even from like a liver perspective, in terms of recycling lactate and providing glucose and doing all of the magic things that the liver does. So that's your global. That's like, I need more of those cardiovascular adaptations. Now, when it comes to the local, we're either doing what we call like an incomplete rest method, like the Duranda or the muscle rounds, or this is, but it's really simple. You just, you do submaximal work and you use density as your fatigue mechanism. The other option is the longer sets, and the longer sets can be high reps or supersets or whatever. When deciding between those two, really kind of what I'm focusing on is that the IRM, from what we can see anecdotally, seems to be less inflammatory. So if that's something that I need to like give somebody a break from, I'm going to kind of go there. So we look at that as kind of our nutrient partitioning. That's that one where we tend to see a lot of volumization. Soreness should go down. It's more of a deload from mechanical tension and stress to do that. If we're doing long sets or we're doing supersets where we're kind of, instead of we're revving the engine, we're kind of like trying to push all the way to the red line and hold it there for a little bit, that's going to tax the energy production of the cells a little bit more, rather than like promoting like store more stuff. So that's where we would expect to see better improvements in capacity, but it comes at the cost of like, it's probably going to be a little bit more stressful, both from a mechanical and an inflammatory perspective. My theory is that when we're at that point where, oxygen delivery is low and we're asking a lot of demand, to continue ascending to fatigue, is that I think that we throw more free radicals and we have a lot, some more microtrauma because of the fatigue. We end up with what seems to be a net greater inflammatory response from those. We don't tend to be able to do those things as frequently. So like, for instance, an IRM method, you should be able to do that every other day for the same muscle part, and you're able to perform whatever. If you're doing, like, anybody that's actually done a lot of superset training or whatnot knows that, like, okay, if you do that, you're going to need a little bit longer to recover, unless you only did like one set or something like that. So to do any appreciable amount of volume, you need a little bit longer to recover. But those are going to push the energy production mechanisms of your cells more, right? We're taxing the mitochondria more. So we're likely to see more mitochondria biogenesis in like longer sets, supersets, trisets, those things, than we are in the IRM method. So that's where knowing a little bit more about the physiology and kind of making those decisions can be helpful. A lot of times I'm more than happy to like kind of double dip on those things in terms of like, so if I'm taking 2 weeks, what I may do is if I'm focusing on local, the first week may be an IRM, like kind of because it kind of functions as a bit of a deload, and then the following week I progress to like some supersets, and then we get back into the tension training. So basically, we take 2 weeks, we kind of have a deload week, but it's still getting us some metabolic adaptations. Then we level up the metabolic adaptations the following week, and then we go back into our tension based work. So it's kind of like, okay, I'm trying to get a little bit of both, right? And all of these things exist on a continuum, right? It's not like, okay, once you go from 6 reps to 7 reps, it's a drastically physiological, difference or whatever it makes. It's like, no, like all of these things are constantly stimulating everything to a degree. It's just kind of what's getting the bias in those. So we're making a decision of, do we need to have a bit of a deload from stress and focus on nutrient partitioning, which I think is a really good precursor for high volume work. Because if I can get my body to store more glycogen, right, well, then I should be able to tolerate more volume-based, mechanical tension-based work, right? And if we look into like the nuances of like, well, how fast could I get into recovery? How fast could I get AMPK down and mTOR back up and all the little fancy mechanisms that we like to talk about? It seems like, well, that would be a great place to be, right? But if, the thing is that like, man, every time I go to high reps, I just like my performance drops. Well, then maybe actually the thing you need to do is do those high reps or those supersets or whatnot and actually challenge the energy system, because it's more the performance rather than the storage thing that you need to work on. So you could kind of look at how you're performing in training and kind of use that as a, like, okay, which one of these? And if, by all means, I always tell people, if there's a chance that you need to deload, do it. Because worst case scenario, what's going to happen is you're going to come back the next week at higher performance and more recovered. And I'm not trying to encourage people to like use any excuse to take an easy week or whatever. But when we look at this specific population, I would say more often than not, like by the time somebody gets to us, their willingness of effort is not the limiting factor, right? I mean, it's a rare occasion where somebody is willing to invest this much time and money into their physique, but they're just simply not willing to work hard. I think that now we're talking fat loss, I definitely think there's a lot of those. But in terms of hypertrophy, I think people love the work, they love the training, and so if anything, it's almost like sometimes we have to like really argue with people, like, look, like you need to do the week off or whatever, right? And we'll give that to some people or whatever. Like a lot of times, my coaches they'll complain to me like, oh, I put somebody on an ascending load program or an IRM, or it was something where it's like the early sets were submaximal work, right? And the person takes all of the sets to failure, and then they're like trashed. And I'm like, well, and they're like, yeah, well, look, this is what I said. Like I said, like this is supposed to be an RPE or this many reps in the tank or whatever, and you were like, well, it was light, so I just took it there. It's like, yeah, but you had 7 more of those to do. Like you were not supposed to take the first one to failure. That's how you end up lifting the 5-pound dumbbells for lateral raises at the end of your set, right? Yeah.
Really, really cool concept there. And yeah, I think a lot of us in this industry who care about those little percent points suffer from the same psychological traits of just wanting to work and wanting to push it and take things to the next level. Last question for you today, Cass. I think the listeners would have my head if I didn't at least ask you one thing about exercise selection. This can get into a whole podcast episode on itself. So I'll stick to something that's very specific and just out of personal interest, to be completely honest. From what I've heard you discuss for exercise selection, and in terms of creating a complete resistance profile, whether that means maybe we're adding a band to some barbell movement to kind of create a smoother, more complete resistance throughout the movement, or maybe we're picking different exercises within the session itself to make sure we're covering everything. For the back specifically, I find this kind of interesting because mentioning the whole banding concept again, or accommodating resistance, some people think, oh, I'll throw a band on a leg press or a hack squat or something like that. But when it comes to something like a barbell row, I guess you could use some sort of band to kind of smooth things out. But it seems kind of difficult on the surface when I think about it in terms of applying that. how can we create a more complete resistance profile for some of our rowing or even pull down movements? I know personally, if I watch some of my sets after I perform them, it'll look like I'm at like an RP7, and then the next rep I can't get the bar to my belly button on the barbell row or something. How do we kind of fix that? Can we superset exercises to kind of make sure we're completely stimulating the muscle, or what do we have to work with here?
So with the back, you have a profile of basically when you're in a stretch position. So if you're in your pull down, it's when your arms are up, or row, it's when your arms out in front of you. That's your stronger position. And as we start to finish and contract to where our arm is by our side, we're weaker there. So that basically eliminates any of the bands, chains, those type of things, because they're making it harder where it's already hardest. So they're doing the opposite of balancing it out. So if you don't have, I mean, there's a variety of ways that you can do this. Like if you're, like me, and you have like, bougie equipment, I got the Prime stuff where I just move something on a pin or whatever. Awesome. If you don't have that, another thing that I like is if you have things like a hammer strength equipment, anything where there's like a pivot, a lot of times you can change your body position or something so that you basically use that equipment in a non-traditional way so that it goes from being hard to easy. And so the good example of that is we use the hammer row, which a lot of gyms have. And instead of actually using the seat and sitting up against it, we step away from it so that basically as we're doing it, the weight is kind of getting lighter, right? Like the leverage of the machine is changing in a way that it actually gets lighter as we're getting to our weaker point. You got no machines, you're training in your garage, you got nothing but free weights. Partial reps are going to be probably your best thing to go. So I used to teach this all the time with just cables and dumbbells, where I would have somebody use a lighter load that they could get completely full range of motion in, right? And then we essentially do a reverse drop set. So instead of lowering the weight like we typically would to get more full range of motion, we actually go up in weight. And then basically they work within the range of motion that they can move that weight, which may be a half, third, or only a quarter of the rep, but it ends up being in that lengthened portion of the range that was not challenged prior. So for example, you could be in a pull down machine and you could do 6 full reps really squeezing into that short position, right? And as soon as you get to that point where it's like, okay, that was the last one, I could get all the way down, or maybe, if you're taking it to a little bit closer to failure, you get like one, 3/4 rep or 7/8 rep, then you would actually add load to the machine, and then you would basically pull it down as far as you could get. And what'll happen is you'll just get to a sticking point, right? And so you're almost doing an isometric. We call it an isometronic because you're moving into it, and you just would like kind of fight that position for like a second and then repeat those partial reps, right? Where you kind of fight into that sticking point, and the sticking point will move closer and closer to the lengthened position as you do that. So if I can't make a complete profile in a single rep, I can use partials, essentially supersetting the same exercise with itself at different resistances and ranges of motion to essentially get the equivalent of that, right? And I will leave you with one little just tad bit on this too, is that in terms of the resistance profile, because there's some people that think that matching the resistance profile just automatically means that it's better for hypertrophy. And that's not necessarily the case. And I think that's going to be one of the areas where with what we're doing in our labs, we're really going to be able to kind of demonstrate that there are definitely benefits to using multiple resistance profiles. So what I would say, if you want your bases covered, you make sure that you train the muscles in its full ranges of motion. That doesn't have to be in one exercise. A lot of things you need multiple exercises, right? Like you're not going to train your biceps in full range of motion unless you're bowling. That's essentially the only exercise that you can do, which would have to be like a really, really bad bowling form where you like have the arm way behind you and then you're flinging it like over your head. So, that's just the reality of it. And then the other thing is that, challenge them with different resistance profiles. And it doesn't have to be every single workout. It doesn't even have to be every single meso that you accomplish all of these things. And one of the things that we do is that we will bias like the volume of work we have to a certain position or type of a resistance profile within a given workout or maybe even within a given meso. But we'll have the other thing in there just from a maintenance of joint health and function is either maybe just part of the prep work or whatnot, right? So maybe today I'm not training like fully shortened biceps, with my arm like up here or whatever. But maybe as part of my warm up, what I do is I hit a couple reps like this, and then I go into whatever exercise I'm going to do, and I do a couple like as part of my warm up. I just kind of maintain that neuromuscular awareness of the full range of motion of the joint, but I don't have to load it all of the time. And I think that's where really understanding this stuff. Same thing for a resistance profile is that you may say like, well, okay, I'm just going to do something where I kind of squeeze in this area that I'm not doing the majority of my training, right? So if it's a squat session, you may, as part of your warm up, do a leg extension and do some holds at the top just to kind of like get that really locked out knee position loaded for those quads. But then you go do a squat or a hack squat or whatever, where there's essentially no load on the quads really at the top. You're just stacked on your joints. And you're getting the majority of your mechanical loading there. But your nervous system also understands how to create tension in that short position. So the next time you need it, it's not completely detrained.
Fantastic. Kasim, as expected, this was a extremely thought-provoking discussion. I thought it was absolutely fantastic. For the listeners who may not already be supporting you, where can they find out more about you and the great stuff you're doing at N1?
So you can follow me on Instagram. It's coach_Kassem. That's Kassem. And then you can also follow basically our brand accounts is where we put out the most tip-based information. We have at n1.education and at n1.training. Basically, education is a platform built mostly for coaches or for people that want a little bit more of the nuanced information. Training is a great place to go if you want the tips and stuff like that. And we have websites that correspond to each of those. So our courses are on n1.education. And then on training, we have a membership site with an exercise library that covers resistance profiles and positions and whatnot. So if you're curious about exercise selection and you want to know, what's the difference between these machines or what's the difference between, these two exercises in terms of their strength profile or the muscle lengths that they work in, that library is essentially it's essentially a college level anatomy and physiology course in its own if you just go in there and kind of browse those tools. So that's essentially the big beef of that. We have articles and videos and stuff on there as well, but I'd say the meat and potatoes of what we offer on the training site is a exercise library that isn't just like, hey, here's how you do this. It's also gives you a lot of information on what qualities this is. So in terms of pairing exercises and programming, you could play around in there and just we get a lot of people where it's like, well, all I've done is like just played in that library and I've learned more than I did in university. I'm like, awesome, that's why we made it.
And those resources will be in the show notes. I highly recommend to everyone to check these things out. Once again, everyone, that does it for another episode of the Muscle Memoirs podcast. Thank you so much for listening. Until next time.